This presentation is about the paintings which were exhibited in the Palazzo Carli in Sillico, in Garfagnana, between the months of May and June 2019. This exhibition was inaugurated by Maestro Sergio Suffredini and included works both by myself and my good friend Chiara Donald, who also has a connection to the beautiful village of Sillico. Like all children, I have had experience while at school in trying to paint, but I had been assured by my teachers that my efforts did not show much talent, and being of an inherently competitive nature, I therefore decided that if I wasn't good at this, I would not continue it. However, in 2006, encouraged by a colleague who, like me, had a very busy and in fact stressful job, I started some art classes for adults in the evenings, which were intended for individuals like me who had little background and perhaps even less ability. I have to say that this was one of the best decisions of my life, as I very quickly became addicted, if nothing else, to painting, and although I have and I retain the impression that my talent is modest at best, I feel that this has become one of the best areas of my life in terms of allowing me to shut out the rest of the world and put myself in another world entirely of my own creation and entirely for myself, outside the other aspects, many of them stressful and competitive, of my life. I am going to go over the individual works exhibited in the Palazzo Carli in order to give some idea of the background of these paintings. This particular work is one of my endeavors to somehow or other emulate the great American expressionist artist Jackson Pollock, and this one was particularly successful. It is not as easy as people think to express oneself artistically by these drip paintings. This work was conducted in Barga in the early months of 2016. The material was canvas, and the paint itself was a mixture of house acrylic paint as well as enamel paint. I find the results of this large work quite pleasing. It is called Accident in Springs, 1956, and those of you who are familiar with the life of Jackson Pollock would of course be aware of the significance of this title. For those of you who do not, I encourage you to look it up. This is a painting, a landscape of the night scene on the banks of the River Yarra in South Melbourne, my favorite and residential city when I'm in Melbourne, Australia, and it shows one of the several bridges over the Yarra against the background of the river itself and lights on the water. This particular aspect of trying to draw light on water and paint light on water is one of my favorite endeavors in art. The work was carried out in Melbourne, I believe, around about 2012, and this is a simple oil on canvas type medium. This is one of the first works carried out when I moved to live in Tuscany, and this of course shows in oil on canvas the famous Duomo of the town of Barga, seen to some extent from the terrace from the house where I then lived. A very beautiful church in one of the very beautiful towns in our zona of Mediavalle and Garfagnana. This work shows the spiaggia, the beach in Massa, again inspired by the zona, inspired by the area where I live, on the coast near Massa Carrara, and again was executed sometime in early 2015 while I was in fact in Melbourne on oil on canvas. This is a particularly favorite work showing a landscape scene carried out in the town of Paysandú in Uruguay, one of my favorite countries and one of my, in fact, favorite towns. And it shows dusk falling on what was, in fact, a winter's day on the bridge which spanned Paysandú across the river Uruguay to the Argentinian town of Colón. In fact, crossing this bridge, which I have had occasion to do, one very simply and easily crosses the border between these two fine countries. I myself have a great affection for Uruguay, and the silhouetted figures which one can see over there are in fact myself and my colleague and friend Dr. Anna Chokling, who at this time was hosting a scientific conference in Paysandú, in which I was honored also to speak. This shows the famous Ponte di Diavolo, which is constructed spanning the Serchio River near the town of Borgo Amazzano, a very famous bridge, and I repeat, Ponte di Diavolo, and I encourage perusal of the origins of this very ancient but still extremely robust construction. Again, oil on canvas. This is another favored work. It is showing a landscape from a point in the village of Sillico, where in fact this exhibition was held, and this is from the so-called Campo Romano, and I call this the view from Rosaria's seat, because Rosaria once told me that when as a child she used to go to the Campo, she used to sit on the flat rock, which in fact still exists, and look at this view and reflect that when she was gone and when we all are gone, this area will still, very hopefully, still be the same. I think this was a very beautiful sentiment accompanying a stunning view, and I am glad that the work executed on oil on canvas round about July, August of 2016 was so successful. This shows, in fact, one of the more famous parts of the mountain ranges of the Apuani that we have here surrounding our zona, showing the range called the Uomo Morto, so called because the chain of mountains give a very distinct impression of a man asleep or dead, and this is showing the scene during the winter when much of the landscape is covered with snow. This is showing one of the very few waterfalls in Tuscany. This is the waterfall near Pisa in Saturnia, and was executed again in late 2015 on oil on canvas. I believe this is one of the first landscapes I did when I came to live in Tuscany. This is from a photograph of the Dolomiti Mountains, where many people, Italians and from outside Italy, go to ski in the winter. A very, very limited palette, as you can see, basically executed using black and white on canvas pad, oil paints throughout. I am pleased with the result, as I think one of the most significant challenges for a painter is to actually gain an effective result with a limited palette. This is one of two paintings in the exhibition showing the moon. It is entirely, I think, from my head, although I had seen pictures of the full moon preceding the days in which this painting was executed. But the result came out quite well, showing the moon over the land, over the earth, and as a sort of last-minute thought, I tried to effect some reflection on the ground, which in fact came out quite pleasingly. Again, oil on canvas. This was executed, this picture, on oil on canvas, around about 2012, 2013, when I was spending a lot of my life in the beautiful town of Annapolis in Maryland. This is the capital city of Maryland, USA, about 1 hour drive from Washington, D.C. And it is beautifully situated on the Chesapeake Bay. And in summer, this is a stunningly beautiful place. This is taken from a photograph which I took of sailing boats on the Chesapeake while dusk was falling. I find the effect reasonably effective and pleasing. This is a rustic scene in which I attempted, as I have often done, to combine media by attempting to incorporate into the canvas through the paint clay in order to give the two figures, which you can see, some level of enhanced texture, as well as sawdust into the trees and vegetation, again for the same reason. The canvas is reasonably large, and I believe this was effected sometime in 2017. This is called domestic argument. Again, two figures, one supposed to be male, the other supposed to be female. A lot of texture again incorporated through the use of modeling clay along with the paint, and a reasonable effect showing some level of vivacity in the figures, perhaps aggression on the male on the right, a defensive posture perhaps came out in the other figure, which is why I elected to give it its title of Domestic Argument. This is a work, a large canvas executed in oil and initiated by, before application of any paint, a random application again of modeling clay on the canvas, and I then proceeded to start putting in paint somewhat randomly without really having much in my mind. A limited palette again. Now I call this the approaching surge of Donald Trump. This was effected in the summer of 2016, and somehow the canvas, without any intention, showed me when at a certain stage several macabre faces, which I think reflected my gravely apprehensive state at what I then was convinced was going to be the outcome of the US presidential election in November of 2016. I think I was in a very small minority in anticipating with somber confidence the election of Mr. Trump. And I think this came out in the somewhat macabre faces, which I then confess I proceeded to enhance where the occasion lent itself on the canvas. This is another Pollockian, if I may put it that way, simulation given as a gift to Rosaria Bonini, who proceeded to honor the canvas with this magnificent frame, cornice, which we get from the shop of the Aiosa in Castelnuovo di Garfagnana, a very fine manufacturer of these frames, and also extremely good in giving us very good advice. The work itself was done in Annapolis, I believe around about 2014, and involved again the use of house paint purchased in small samples and an attempt to generate a coordination of color and shape, which in this instance, and this does not always happen, came out reasonably well. This is one of the few watercolors in the exhibition. Watercolor is a medium which is capable of exquisitely beautiful results in the hands of expert artists, like, for example, in fact, Maestro Sergio Suffredini, who honored us with his opening remarks. You can actually find the opening of the exhibition on another YouTube video. This shows simply a ceramic pot executed in the raku style, which was executed in Australia, in Melbourne, some years ago, and I managed to achieve a reasonable result in watercolor in this instance. This is a similar work on another ceramic pot. This time it is a teapot executed by a ceramic artist in Canberra, and this work was purchased, and I proceeded to attempt to capture the work using watercolor, which in this instance came out reasonably well. This is a picture which is easily perhaps the largest canvas in the exhibition. It is a large work executed in oil. As you can see, an abstract work, but not in the style of Pollock. And I painted this in the early winter months, winter in the southern hemisphere, in Canberra, Australia, in the weeks preceding my departure from my position in the government. I was, as can be expected, in a state of some turmoil, and I called this work Synapsis, Exit and Hope, to try to capture some of the resonance of the picture itself along with my emotions at the time. This work in acrylic, I believe executed sometime in early 2008, was the result of my first attempts, I think, in trying to approach some level of abstraction. I called this work initially Lunge. It is a substantial canvas, but it was, if I remember, inspired by a photograph of landscape following an Australian bushfire. Many people think that bushfires are simply destructive, but they actually have an interesting effect on the landscape, particularly in the days and weeks succeeding them, which can lead to quite interesting outcomes if one is able to capture them, as I believe in some ways this highly abstracted deception managed to do. This is another large canvas, and I call this Bella la Garfagnana. Garfagnana is beautiful. This shows in the background the mountain range, l'Uomo Morto, which was shown in the earlier picture as during the winter, but this shows the range in more clement weather. The foreground is some of the valleys, including some of the little villages, the small borghi, which we have in this zona. There are some unfortunate errors in the description of the range, as people who are proudly resident here are quick to point out to me. But overall, the work is well executed, and of course, the usual stunningly good frame from the Iosa shop sets it out quite well. Executed in oil on canvas with heavy incorporation from my friend Lorenzo in the village of Sillico, who supplies me when I need with the sawdust to incorporate this from his own profession as a wood artist and carpenter. This is another canvas showing the moon, It is somewhat figurative, but it is captured from a photograph taken while I was visiting Portland in Oregon, the house of my very dear friend Lynn Boschkoff, who lives there, um, hosted me for several visits. This was captured during a fine evening where we were with other friends, and the deception of the moon with the small sort of skyline reflection of the moon there, I think managed a pleasing effect. Executed in oil on canvas um, in the, let me think, the summer of 2015. I believe this was the first work executed on a fine new easel which I had been given for my birthday at this time. This is a somber work, a large canvas, in fact painted on another painting which preceded it. It is not often that I do this, but this work, which is entitled Je suis Carli, was executed in January of 2015, immediately succeeding the assassination of the journalists of Charlie Hebdo in Paris. I was immensely moved by this occasion, the murder of journalists. Unfortunately, this has become a trend, and we have seen it happen in other countries. The whole of France and the whole of the world was shaken with this event, and the sad and tragic nature permeates the painting with the figure of the stricken figure on the ground with a background of symbology from various religions, which was what was used, in fact, to assassinate these journalists, executed in oil and canvas. Here is an interesting work called The Wood in Winter. A curious work. You can see the textured surface of the painting because it was preceded by an attempt at another drip painting which I was not satisfied with, and which was then covered with Standard Oil paint. And while I was still generating a background for whatever was to come after, the work, as frequently is the case, proceeded to take over and generate this rather interesting deception of perhaps a dark wood during winter with snow on the ground. Again, an interesting work showing another aspect of winter. This is essentially called the zona in winter, the zone in winter, and it is effectively coming out in terms of mist and covering most of the mountain area. Again, this was initiated without any clear aim in mind, but the gods were kind and gave what, for me anyway, is a fine effect, strikingly again set out by the fine frame. And this is a very interesting deception of a couple of monstrous creatures embraced in a somewhat macabre way, embracing, but the sharpness of the teeth indicates that perhaps love was not foremost in their minds. This is extracted, although not copied, from a book by the Garfagnana artist Pentosi, who I had become acquainted a few months before through his book illustrating the work Orlando Furioso of the famous Ludovico Ariosto, one of the most important historical figures in this region from 500-600 years ago. I encourage perusal for those of you who are interested. You will see that there is a substantial amount of texture incorporated into the paint in order to bring out the figures, and it leads to interesting effects where the light hits in various angles. I am very, very fond of this particular work which is again a mixed medium incorporating modeling clay, wax, and a variety of paints, both acrylic, oil, and I think also house paints, all converging together in what I think came out as a remarkably effective deception, executed sometime, I believe, in 2013, again in Annapolis. And this is a curious creature. This was deliberately painted as such. It shows a caterpillar from a somewhat rare species. I cannot remember the species now, but I was struck by the exquisite shape and colors of this creature crawling up a twig, and I gave it a background of also striking colors, trying to retain the construct of the caterpillar. I call it lysergenic caterpillar because a friend of mine suggested that I must have been on some curious substance when I was in fact painting this. This was painted again on oil, on canvas, but with substantial incorporation of clay into the paint in order to achieve texture again. This is simply an abstraction of floral theme, perhaps with some garden in mind, but definitely an abstraction. And again, the work incorporates a lot of texture through the use of clay, which I find very effective because the colors are then exposed at different angles rather than on a flat surface, and the light captures it in different ways with pleasing effects. And this is, my dear friends, of the coro of the choir Donne in Cerca di Guai, women looking for trouble. It shows very figurative deception, with the exception of Rosaria Bonini, who was deliberately brought out in relation to the capacity to recognize. It was painted in 2016. I am quite happy at what was achieved, and when the exhibition is over, it will go back to the room which the donne, which the ladies use to practice their songs every week, and in which I frequently attend because it is a very pleasant experience. Again, a lot of texture achieved by the use of the clay. This is a simple Matisseian style still life, capturing an aspect of a room viewed from above, oil on canvas again. Nothing remarkable, but I think the coordination of the various objects is quite well achieved. This was one of the very first efforts in watercolor. This is again a gift from the gods. I had no particular intention to achieve this result. It is called Fire and Ice, but the initial composition was attempting to cover a landscape, a photograph of a landscape in a mountain range in Brazil. But this is what ensued as a result of my inexperience, if you like, in handling watercolor. But I find the effect to be very acceptable and pleasing. The work is executed on paper, obviously, and the frame in this instance was purchased commercially from an outlet in Canberra. This is a calm landscape, somewhat in a somewhat Chinese type style, captured from a photograph of a simple boat on a lake, one of two such works, again in watercolor, very lightly applied and a very limited palette, and I believe that the result is acceptable and pleasing. This is a large canvas. I'm very happy with it. It is an acrylic depiction of Lake George, which is about 40 kilometers outside Canberra on the way to Sydney. And it shows Lake George, which is a large lake, very frequently without any water because of drought, which affects us in Australia quite frequently. And this was extracted from a photograph showing this phenomenon, and executed in watercolor on this large canvas. Again, I believe that I managed to get a good result showing the various pools of water and the drying and the generation of the muddy surfaces, and on the other side of the lake, the land with some scattered farmyards, as in fact they are. This work was done sometime in 2006. This is another watercolor showing a water scene executed again in Canberra. I believe this was done from a photograph taken from a calendar. This is a particular favorite of people who see this work. It achieved a reasonable result, showing the boat with the wake behind it, which was actually achieved not as should be the case in watercolorists by simply not applying paint, but was achieved by applying correcting fluid in order to give this starkly white wake to the passage of the boat. Good depiction of the reflection in the water. This was painted oil on canvas in November 2010 while I was listening to the television giving out the somber results of the midterm elections in that year, when the Democratic Party lost its majority in the lower house through a landslide for the Republican Party. This was a somber thing to happen. It was a dark winter's evening. I painted the work from a photograph which was actually showing two children looking at an eclipse. But I found the somber nature of the final result evoked in me a feeling of sadness, and so I called this homeless. Needless to say, I don't think the children were homeless in real life. The moon is shown as being a yellowish tinge, and this was probably the result of the eclipse. This is a simple landscape, pretty much spontaneously evoked in acrylic, I believe, on canvas, showing the sun setting on a standard Australian bush landscape. There's nothing much more to be said, but the work is quite nice. This is one of two similar abstract works utilizing shapes and colors in an attempt to achieve complementarity in the colors, as well as some level of abstraction of a definite theme. I call this nuclear family. This particular work is, again, oil on canvas, executed in Melbourne sometime in 2014. This is a complementary work to the other, again utilizing shapes and colors and an attempt to achieve complementarity, and it was only in an advanced stage that I started to see in this work a depiction of somebody, in this instance perhaps myself, giving a lecture or a presentation to an audience. So I called this lecture in Paysandu to complement the event in Paysandu which I referred to earlier, which was organized by my friend Anna Chokling, and which I carried out while I was there. This is one of some works utilizing as subjects, still life subjects, the pottery of Josephine Cassar, in Canberra. She's now residing in Melbourne, a ceramic artist of a very high caliber, and this particular work is executed using watercolor pencil, which is in my hands as a somewhat untalented, particularly watercolor artist, I find is easier to control than the standard way of achieving watercolor with brushes, and it shows 3 of these spots which I attempted to position in a way as to give a reasonably pleasing shape. Similarly, this is a still life, in this instance from our then home in Canberra, from the lounge, showing this flower vase on a table with objects in the background, including a bookcase and some sculptures and some paintings. Watercolor on watercolor canvas, a medium which has some advantages compared to paint, but in some ways is even less easy to control. And this is a pleasing, in my mind anyway, again, still life achieved with absolutely limited palette, again, black and white, striving for the reflections, the shadows and the shapes, painted from life in Melbourne in an artist's class which I attended for some weeks in the summer, in January of 2015, before departing for Tuscany. I'm quite happy with this result. It is on oil on canvas, and as I said, it is painted from life, and I had to strive to ensure that I painted what I saw and not what I thought I saw, and I found that as a result of this, things came out actually very well. Here is another watercolor achieved under some level of direction by the Canberra artist Dermot Seymour, a friend of mine who gave me some lessons, and we devoted several sessions to this work. It is again a watercolor, and unusually for a watercolor, therefore it is achieved in more than one session, in fact in 2 or 3, showing again from life some objects, including this vase with some interesting decorations, a small glass container with some flowers, and most importantly, of course, the shadows being thrown by these objects in the way the light was positioned. This watercolor was executed, I believe, sometime in 2007, 2008. And here is another oil color, again from works by Josephine Cassar. Again, I was interested in getting different shapes and attempting to get lights well positioned on this work, which I think happened reasonably well in terms of the reflections which are shown. Executed, I believe, in Annapolis sometime in 2012, 2013, again with oil on canvas. I believe this may be the last work, another quite nice still life achieved in the same series of classes as the previous still life, 2 pairs, absolutely nothing except black and white. It is really very satisfying to see a good result in this limited palette, and I believe that this is the last work, so thank you very much for being interested in this series of paintings.